Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a first look at the new Canon EOS R full-frame mirrorless camera system. Now, a few months ago at the time of the announcement, I released a video episode where I went through and I kind of broke down what I liked and what I didn't like, at least based on the actual announcement. So now that I have the camera hands-on, I'm going to see how accurate I was in doing those things. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a close look at the build, the design, some of the features, the specs of the camera, how it actually plays out, features like the touch bar. I'll be looking at both the conventional adapter along with the adapter that does have the control ring as a part of it as well. So we're going to jump in and I'm going to give you a closer look at the camera and how it actually functions ergonomically in the hands. Let's take a look. So let's jump in and let's take a closer look at the new Canon EOS R body. And so certainly when it comes to the basic ergonomics of the camera, there is a lot going for it. Canon really knows how to do this really well. And of all of these mirrorless bodies I've used, while there's still a little bit of room for my pinky there, I would say that in the hand, the grip feels the best of any mirrorless body that I've used. Just a really natural fit there, good curves everywhere. And so my hand goes on there well. My knuckles aren't hitting against the lens, and so some positives there when it comes to that. There is a little bit different of a texture for those of you that have been using Canons for a long time. The kind of the textures on this camera feel a little bit different, maybe a little bit more of a matte on some of the finish areas, but then the grip itself has almost a little bit more of a rubberized type feeling. Feels good though. The camera itself feels really good. Of course, the huge physical pro here is this great articulating touchscreen. And this is something that nobody else is really doing to the degree that Canon is doing it. And so Canon does a great job with a lot of things. First, of course, the articulating screening is much more useful than the tilting screen of the Sony, or I'm also looking at the Fuji X-T3, and this is the best of the bunch. Also, of course, Canon is really good when it comes to utilizing touch screens and their ability to touch to focus or touch to take images. Everything works. It's more responsive. Their touchscreens are the most responsive in the business. Of course, for stills, Sony doesn't even allow you to touch to focus. And while Fuji does, the screen is definitely much more laggy than what Canon's is. So good things there. This is a 3.15-inch LCD with 2.1 million dots. So good resolution. It looks good. Everything is interesting there. Now at the top of the screen, also somewhat unique to Canon, is this actual LED or LCD screen at the top that can show different kinds of function on there. And so certainly that is a useful thing there. And as per typical for Canon, you have the option of displaying both more information on there. You can also hold this down and you can light up the screen. And so that's useful. And so the button, just clicking it will allow you to have more or less information showing up on there. So looking top down, that's always useful. And so that I do like. Something that I'm somewhat undecided about is Canon's touch bar that they have added here. And so in lieu of some other kind of wheel, and what I would really prefer is if they were to implement some kind of joystick, thumbstick there. They've got this, and so you can program different functionality to it. I've got it set up right now to do ISO, and so if I slide my thumb across that, it will bring up the ISO and it will make changes to that. One thing that I found that I had to do, at first I was just completely hating it, but there is a setting that will lock it, and so you have to almost like tap to unlock it and then utilize it. I didn't like that at all, and so I'm finding it more useful to turn the lock off, and so it's always ready to go. There probably will be some inadvertent brushes of it, but there haven't been a lot of those in my case. Now, one thing that I really do like is that Canon has designed with these new lenses, and a part of the changes in the RF mount is the ability to route more information through the electronic contacts, which we'll look at it in just a moment. But it's allowed them to add on to these cameras what they are calling a control ring on native RF lenses, and then also you can get an adapter that has this ring built in, so you can utilize it with other adapted lenses. So you have the ability to program a variety of different functions to this. Right now I've got it set up to control aperture, and so you can use it almost like a manual aperture ring. In this case, you're making aperture changes right there within the body. So certainly useful when it comes to that. I will note, at least in this particular lens, the 24-105, it means that because you've taken this real estate for something else, it means that the zoom ring and the manual focus ring are really close together. And so fortunately, they've got a texture variation there, but I mean, it certainly would not be out of the realm of possibility to have some overlap there when you're just kind of feeling in a tactile kind of sense. I do also note that the shutter action is really good. The shutter release is good. And then the action, there's such low vibration from it that I've already noted a significant improvement, even with equivalent lenses, hand holding them compared to my 5D Mark IV and the EOS R here. That low vibration allows you to get better handheld shots. Also excellent is the viewfinder here. Canon's done a great job with this. It's high resolution, 3.69 million dots, so like the A7R Mark III. Lots of positives when it comes to that. And so that's great there. The viewfinder looks good looking through it. And of course, you have the ability to put lots of information in there to help make your job easier when shooting. And you have the ability to kind of set up different information to be inside there. I also like the fact, although there's some people that have been critical of the fact that it uses the legacy battery of, in this case, it is the LPE6N, although you can also use LPE6s. Those of us that are longtime Canon shooters, we've been using these batteries for a while, so we've got a number of them. And so the complaint has been, well, it's got a terrible rating. The rating is 370 actual shots. But the reality is that everybody, including myself that has tested this camera so far, has found that the battery life has dramatically exceeded that rating, and often getting not just double but triple times that. And so I would say so far what I'm seeing is that the battery life is just as good and probably better than what it is in my 5D Mark IV. And so I don't really consider that to be an issue. And so I'm back to believing that having that shared battery is a positive thing. So good there. Now, not so good is when it comes to charging is that under this port, we do finally have a USB-C terminal here that theoretically supports in-camera battery charging. I say theoretically because so far it only seems to work with a few exceptions if you are using an expensive adapter, about $140 or something. And I noted that someone else managed to get, there's certain kinds of power banks that will it has to have a power send to make it work, but that seems to be inconsistent at best also. And so byproduct of this is that it seems great to have in-camera battery charging, but when I actually tried to utilize it as I have with either a Sony or a Fuji body in a useful kind of situation, you know, with a little portable power bank that I had on hand, it does not charge at all. And so, you know, byproduct of that is that's not so great. I mean, I don't see why Canon has to make this accessory driven when everybody else is able to, you can power them off of pretty much anything. Another bit of a fail here for a lot of shooters is the fact that there's only a single card shot here. And, you know, I'm sure that there will be future bodies that have multiple card slots, but only one SD slot that is here right now. Good news is that unlike the card slot on the 5D Mark IV, it is UHS 2 compatible, which means you can get the faster write speeds. One of the features that initially didn't get talked about a whole lot, but is it's so huge and so smart that you wonder why in the world didn't everyone else think of this already. And that is that when you're going to change lenses, it will actually protect the sensor, drop down that to cover it, which is huge in keeping dust off the sensor. My Sony A7R Mark III is the biggest dust magnet that I've ever owned, and so I mean that's a big deal right there, just on a very practical everyday level. Magnesium alloy body, and the body feels good, you know, and it's hard to determine weather sealing by just looking at it, but it's been suggested weather sealing is something comparable to 6D Mark II, so not quite at the 5D4 level, but, you know, good weather sealing, and probably better, I suspect, than what, say, the A7R Mark III is. I do also like a couple of other things about this mount. For one thing, now the actual mount position is dead on. Okay, that's nice because before it was over here at, you know, roughly 2 o'clock. It makes it just easier to just line that up and go with it, and so that's nice. Also kind of cool, just to break things up, is the somewhat of a chrome titanium accent that matches the RF lenses to the actual mount there. Just kind of a nice visual touch there. You will also note that this is a big lens mount, and there's a lot of good things to note about that. But even looking at the lens cap itself and the rear, you can see that this is it's a completely new kind of lens cap and going around a bigger in diameter lens. What has been allowed here is that now there are additional pins here. There are 12 rather than 8 pins in this new mount, which allows Canon just the ability to do some different things. And already the early patents and the original lenses amongst them, it shows the potential for some really unique lens design. And I think in a lot of ways, the potential of the RF lens mount may be one of the most exciting things about this camera system so far. But as far as the ergonomics, there are a number of good things here. The ability to program more in mirrorless fashion. There's more ability to customize buttons and what they do, and the function of the wheels than ever before. So some plus things when it comes to that. Now underneath the hood, this is a Digic 8 processor, so the newest generation of Canon's processors. And so it has a similar 30 megapixel sensor to the 5D Mark IV, which I found to be a very good sensor in a lot of ways. Dynamic range lags a little bit behind some of the competition from Sony and Nikon, but at the same time, it's a solid sensor. And of course, Canon's color science remains some of the very, very best. One sensor fail that at least I consider to be a fail is the lack of in-body image stabilization. This is a real advantage, I think, to go with in mirrorless, and I suspect that Canon will probably adopt it in the future. Their position has always been that they like lens-based image stabilization better, that it works better. But after having used the A7R III and the A6500, the A7R II, A7 III, all of those bodies with Sony's in-body image stabilization, I have to say that it seems to work as well as what most lens image stabilization works. And so I'm kind of pushing back on Canon on that. I think that employing somewhat of a hybrid result in the future may be fantastic, but I do think that Canon has got to get in-body image stabilization in there. For me, it makes using, even like my manual focus lenses so much easier. Say my Zeiss Milvus 135 millimeter f2, to have the in-body image stabilization from the Sony with that lens makes it a real joy to use. So Canon, you just need to do it. Also, a limitation of this camera is that underneath the hood, it has what seems on paper a pretty decent burst rate, 8 frames per second, that initially would seem to somewhat match what Sony is doing right now with the A7 series, but you quickly discover that with continual AF, that's actually only 5 frames per second, which is not all that impressive. And so if you actually want to track anything, which is typically the reason why we use burst rates, that 8 frames per second is useless. It is the 5 frames per second that's going to be the real figure for you. Also lagging behind Sony is the buffer depth of 47 RAW files and 100 JPEGs. So let's put that into and just start it and see how that frame rate plays out. And so one thing you can see is that there is very little lag in writing to the card. So they're ahead of Sony when it comes to that, but certainly in terms of the flexibility of the camera, you know, and the actual burst rate, that's still lagging somewhat. I will note here that I still do really like the way that Canon's Q menus function, because, you know, you can pull up the quick menu, but then you can actually touch whatever you want, and that is very, very handy. The other place where the camera is under spec is when it comes to video performance. That in some ways is a step beyond the 5D Mark IV in that it does have natively, it has C-Log, and it does have better codec options, but it's still topped off for 4K at 4K 30 frames per second. And that is at that terrible 1.7 times crop. So that is a limitation there. Now, one place where Canon has closed somewhat of a loophole is with their adapters. The adapters for this are not only support EF, they support EFS. And so if you are adapting some of Canon's own EFS lenses to the system, you can now do that, and those lenses will work quite well when it comes to the crop factor. And so that is a plus there. And so I'm glad to see that they've closed that, because before you could use APS-C lenses, like on the 5D Mark IV, for example. I could use a Tamron or a Sony APS-C lens, which utilizes an EF mount. So Canon was really only limiting its own EFS lenses for that. So that is a step in the right direction. But of course, you know, the poor overall specs are still not all that impressive. You know, you do get better results in that because you don't have that massive, massive motion JPEG codec. You can actually get longer record times. But even on something like getting 120 frames per second for doing slow motion, you're still capped at 720, which is frankly somewhat ridiculous at this point. The ISO is natively 100 to 40,000. It is expandable, of course, to from 50 ISO 50 to 102,000, whatever that plays out to. But you're going to mostly want to stay within that native ISO range. Now, this utilizes Canon's dual pixel AF, which of course is great on a lot of levels. And it is the most robust iteration of this ever. It has 5,655 selectable AF points. You've got a variety of different ways on how to access those, and so you can do face and eye tracking to some degree. You've got 1 point, you've got expanded, you've got support, you've got zone, you've got vertical and horizontal zones. And so you've got the ability to cover a big portion of the frame or the sensor itself with AF points. And so that is positive. What's even more positive, however, is the focus speed, particularly with these RF lenses. It is incredibly fast. I mean, as fast as what you have ever seen. Incredibly fast and incredibly sensitive. And if you're using, I think that with a lens like this, it's sensitive down to a -4 EV. But if you're using like the new 50mm f1.2, it is sensitive down to an incredible -6 EV, which is just better than what has ever been done before. Now, it also, the autofocus works really well, essentially natively with adapted lenses, EF mount or EFS mount lenses. And so the only thing that I notice, autofocus speed is fantastic. The only thing that I notice is that there is a little bit more AF noise with these other lenses that are not designed around mirrorless per se. But it's a minor little thing. Autofocus, though, is extremely fast, and this is going to give you, if you've wanted to use your Canon lenses, Canon mount lenses, kind of natively on a mirrorless body, this is the way to do it for sure. So final positives to point out is that I do think that Canon has priced this reasonably. It pretty much has a lot of what the 5D Mark IV does, better in some areas. at a, certainly a much less expensive price point at around $2,200 compared to what was $3,500 at launch for the 5D Mark IV. Of course, in some ways it means that Canon really needs to go down market with the 6D Mark II because, frankly, you would be much better served buying this than a 6D Mark II. And at the same time, also, you could consider a Sony a7 III, which in a lot of ways has more specs going for it than what this camera does. But they've done a good job, I think, for the first kick at the can. The problem is that some of these other manufacturers are, they're multiple generations in, and so they've already been able to solve some of these kinks. And so I think that Canon does have a ways to go in terms of being truly competitive with like the a7 III or the a7R Mark III. But I do think that Canon has some uniquely innovative things that are going on that has a lot of potential for the future. And so there are both strengths and weaknesses that are inherent in Canon's first generation of full-frame mirrorless bodies. There's a lot of things that they have done right. The basic ergonomics are really great. The grip feels fantastic. Things that Canon traditionally does well. Touchscreen is fantastic. It's the best implementation of that. Autofocus system on a lot of levels is good. However, it is going to be hamstrung at this point by a low burst rate and the inability to use it for tracking serious action, not because the autofocus system can't necessarily keep up, but because of the limitations of how fast you can actually stop action with that burst rate. And so there definitely is some areas left to work on with the camera, but I will be coming back to you and kind of delving into the sensor performance a little bit more, as well as comparing it to maybe some other cameras and seeing how it performs in dynamic range and at high ISO settings, and even how it compares to like the 5D Mark IV, and see if these sensors really are identical or if there is some differentiating things there. And so anyway, stay tuned as I will cover all of those things and, of course, be back with my final verdict. In the meantime, however, you can look in the description down below and you can look at images that I am compiling as a part of this review process. Some images that give you closer looks at the camera itself, and, of course, images that I've taken both with the native kit lens 24-105 f4L, and this is in the new RF mount. And I'll also be giving you a review of that lens, which, by the way, it is definitely the best 24-105 that Canon has done. I like it a lot better than what I did the LIS Mark II lens, and I can tell you that already. But anyway, I will cover that, but then also adapted lenses, both some EF and some EFS. We'll throw that in there just for the fun of it. And so stay tuned for all of that, and I will be back to you shortly. In the meantime, if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, look in the description down below. There are a number of different, or buying links to a number of different vendors there. You can take a look at that. You can also find linkage to follow me on social media, become a patron, or subscribe for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.